In this video, I want to spend some time thinking about the phenomenology of guilt and in what way may that help us consider certain aspects of an objective ethical view. So, Nagel actually spends some time in the chapter discussing guilt as well. So, let's begin there. Nagel thinks that the feeling of guilt is very significant because it might be an objection, it might be used as an objection to the whole idea of our ability to give a foundation for an objective morality. I think what Nagel's thought here is something like this. It might be the case that human nature is inherently selfish or self interested. This is a view that's sometimes endorsed by a number of philosophers. For instance, Hobbes thought that human nature was entirely selfish, self-interested in this way. This is a view that many people have kind of associated with human nature. You might disagree. You may think that no, human nature is not purely selfish, but we're going to run with this thought. We're going to kind of consider what Nagel has to say. Well, if you agree, if you think that human nature is kind of selfish in this way, well, then we are primarily, if not entirely, motivated by things like what makes us feel good or some sort of concern for ourselves. And for Nagel, if that's correct, then it turns out that a universal or objective way of thinking about morality would be hopeless. To see why, just consider what we would say if we thought that X was moral, right? On this view, if we thought X was moral, it would only be because we thought that X makes us feel good. Likewise, if we say that Y is morally wrong, well, this would be because we thought that Y makes us feel bad. Well, what exactly does all of this have to do with the feeling of guilt? According to this kind of view, what I'm calling a pessimistic view of what motivates us, we ultimately want to avoid this feeling of guilt for things that we've done wrong. And we want to avoid things like regret, or we want to feel the praise of, self-congratulations when we do something that's right. Now think about that. Is this correct? Does this make sense? For example, why do people not murder and rape? Well, on this view, it would say something like, because they don't want to feel guilty by doing such things. Why is it that people take care of their children or help the poor? This view would say, it's because we want to feel good about doing such things. Now, it might be true that helping your child, taking care of your child, providing for your child, or helping the poor, or whatever it might be, these sort of things may feel make a person feel good. But is that really the ultimate reason why we help our children? It's certainly not the reason why I help my child. My daughter is an amazing human being. The reason why I take care of her is because I love her. I want the best for her, not because I feel good when I do that. In fact, oftentimes when I take care of her, it's not the thing that I really want to do the most. Maybe I want to sleep in, or maybe I want to, go out with my friends, but I need to take care of my child, and I do so because I love my child. I want what's best for my child. So you might think that it's just very odd to say that these are the reasons for why we either do things or don't do things, because we want to feel good, or we want to avoid feeling bad. Now, the way that Nagel puts this point is, even if we think that we do sometimes feel these ways, these feelings are not themselves motivations for acting. So, if we are going to try to establish that there are some sort of grounds for morality, then we're going to need to appeal to something independent, the feeling of guilt. And I think that Nagel is right about this. I don't want to disagree per se with what Nagel is saying here, but I think that there's something else too. I think this might be too quick to completely dismiss or outright reject our feelings of guilt. And here's why. First, I've heard many undergraduates say things like morality is associated in some way with a feeling of guilt. I'm not sure that any philosophers, though, actually hold that view, at least not without various additional elements that would help us get a better grip on what is actually being said. So I think that the whole point may be nothing more than a straw man kind of fallacy. But again, while I do think this might be too quick and it may be something of a straw man fallacy, I don't disagree with everything that he's saying here. The second point that I want you to think about here is that what Nagel says regarding human nature is probably just too simplistic. Many philosophers have said numerous things about human nature. I think that it might be just a little bit too quick or a little bit too simplistic to say, ah, well, some people think that human nature is just inherently selfish. It's far more complex than that. Now, the third thing that I want to mention is that Nagel claims that the feeling of guilt is not connected to our motivation for action at all. You might think that that's not true. Indeed, you might think that the feeling of guilt is oftentimes very instructive. So I want to think about that point in a little more detail. What is the phenomenology of guilt and regret? When I'm talking about the phenomenology here, I'm talking about when we introspectively reflect upon our experience. It's not merely some qualitative feeling that we have or some emotion that comes upon us. Rather, when we do phenomenology, we're sort of inspecting and introspectively looking at, examining, and inquiring into the details of our first person experience. Right? What's really going on with our experience? What sort of things does our experience tell us? So that's what I mean here by phenomenology of guilt. What is it in our phenomenology, in our introspective evidence, that could tell us something about these sorts of situations? And we can do this in a way that's oriented towards the past as well as the future, right? We can consider what our phenomenology of guilt and regret says about the things we've done in the past, and we can do that as a way of projecting ourselves into the future, as a way to kind of think about what we want to do differently, things that we might avoid doing in the future. Another thing that I want to mention about this, about the phenomenology of guilt and regret, is the fact that these things are real. They are a real part of our cognitive and psychological lives. And so we should think about what role they play in our life. We shouldn't be too quick to dismiss them outright. We can often use this kind of phenomenology to try and identify what conditions led up to the things that caused the guilt or the regret. And it's by paying attention to those details, the conditions that cause these feelings in the first place, that can be instructive for us. We can think about what our decisions were and what we could have done different. Then we can apply that to what our future decisions might be, what we might do differently in the future. By reflecting on our phenomenology of guilt and regret, we can recognize these as a kind of warning sign, as a kind of tool to help us think about and plan for future decisions and how our lives might go differently. So, in general, this is why I think that we can use our phenomenology of guilt and regret in a positive way by identifying various moral obligations that we might have, what sort of moral requirements we might take ourselves to be under, and we can also identify what moral obligations might take precedent over other obligations in whatever situations we're considering. So, in a very straightforward way, then, we can use our phenomenology of guilt and regret to help learn from our mistakes and try to do better in the future. And that way, I think that this kind of phenomenology of guilt and regret is very helpful. It's very instructive, and it should not be dismissed in the way that Nagel seems to suggest that it can be. And what that means then is that the phenomenology of guilt and regret is a teaching tool. And if it's a teaching tool in the way that I'm suggesting, then it would be wrong to claim that it's not connected to what motivates our actions at all. Looks like it often can be and is connected to our actions in this sort of way. So, Nagel might be right that our feelings of guilt and regret should not be the only things that motivate us to avoid doing certain moral wrongs or what have you. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't completely dismiss it. It doesn't follow that our phenomenology of guilt and regret cannot be illuminating in the sorts of ways that I have suggested. And that would help us to think about how we can do things differently in the future. And I don't want to indicate that I completely disagree with Nagel on this point, but I just want to suggest that there are ways to push back against some of the things he says here about guilt. However, with all of that said, I think there's something else this helps us to think about. If what I've been suggesting is plausible, then even if we cannot use guilt and regret to determine what exactly the foundations of morality is, still, you might think that it helps us determine that there is some kind of a foundation. And that, in turn, is another reason why I think, we should pay attention to this feeling or this phenomenology of guilt and regret. Again, it may not determine for us what the foundation of morality is, but might be able to help us determine that there is some sort of foundation or grounds for morality in the first place. Of course, it still remains an open question what exactly that would be, whether it would be subjective or objective. We need to think about that point in more detail. But at least we can say that there is some sort of answer to be given, right? And that to me seems significant. And in this way, then, who would argue that our phenomenology of guilt and regret is significant after all, but maybe just in a different way than what Nagel has suggested?